Check something here real quick. We're going to look at these 21 verses tonight, and I've given it the subtitle 10 times better, because that is actually a phrase toward the end of the chapter that is used in reference to Daniel and his three friends. And we're going to find out why that phrase is used as well. All right? So let's open to the book of Daniel, and let's read the first couple verses, and then we'll just kind of take these a few verses at a time and talk about them, if that's okay. And by God's grace, we'll be blessed as a result of that. How you doing, Sidney? Good to see you, brother.
Nice to be here.
Yes, sir. So Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. And this is a little bit of the historical context of the book of Daniel. The Bible reads in verse 1 of Daniel 1, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." Okay, so here we see the historical context, as I mentioned. And one of the things that I really appreciate about the Old Testament is I'm fascinated by the history of the monarchy of Israel, where you have King Saul, and then you have David, and then you have Solomon, and then you have, after Solomon, how the kingdom was divided between the northern and southern dimensions of the kingdom, the northern 10 tribes, and then the southern kingdom of Judah, and how those two kingdoms had very interesting histories. And this text enters into the history of the southern kingdom of Judah. All right. Now, what I want to do is I want to just to give you the historical context, I want to just briefly survey the last 5 kings of Judah. All right, of Judah's monarchy. The last faithful king in the history of Judah was Josiah. He reigned from 640 to about 609 BC. Again, he was the last faithful king of Judah, and he was actually killed at Megiddo. And by the way, the word Megiddo is that root word for Armageddon. Okay? So the Battle of Megiddo is kind of a type for Armageddon. Hey, Sam, Mom's here. And I need my phone. Thank you very much. All right. So that is the context regarding Josiah. And he was killed by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt in battle against the Egyptians. Okay? And you'll find that in 2 Kings 22 and 23 and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35. Okay. Now after Josiah, you had Jehoahaz. He reigned for 3 months in the year 609. Just 3 months. And he was actually deposed by Necho II. And you'll find that in 2 Kings 23 and 2 Chronicles 36. Now after Jehoahaz, you have Jehoiakim, which we just read about here in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. And Jehoiakim came to power in the same year that Josiah died and that Jehoahaz served, in the year 609. And he ruled until 598 BC. He ruled about 11 years as king in Judah. All right? And he was the king in power during the first Babylonian invasion of Judah, all right, which took place in 605 BC. This invasion took place in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, okay? And that was the invasion where Daniel and his friends were taken captive into Babylon, okay? Now, when you go after Jehoiakim, you have Jehoiachin, who ruled in 597 BC. And he, like Jehoahaz, ruled for 3 months, and then he was deposed. And he was the king on the throne when the second Babylonian invasion of Judea and Jerusalem took place in 597. That took place in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. That was when Ezekiel and 10,000 Israelites went into captivity. Okay, and you'll find that in 2 Kings 24 and 2 Chronicles 36. Then finally, the last king of Judah was Zedekiah. He ruled from 597 to 586 BC, and he was in power when the third Babylonian invasion took place. Nebuchadnezzar invaded Judea one last time in 588, And it took him 2 years to take the city, and that's when he finally leveled the temple completely and ended the monarchy in Judah once and for all. All right? That took place in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and again, it was the end of the southern kingdom of Judah. And so what we're doing here is we're picking up the story during Jehoiakim's reign, when that first Babylonian invasion of Judea and Judah took place in 605, when Daniel and his friends went off into captivity. And as we read in verse 2, to show the alleged superiority of his own pagan gods, Nebuchadnezzar took vessels from the Jerusalem temple and placed them in one of the pagan temples in Babylon. It was a sign of superiority and victory when a conquering king would go into the religious temple of those that were vanquished and secure some of those artifacts and take them back and put them as trophies into their own temples of their own gods. Okay? And what's interesting is even the Jerusalem temple had some interesting things in it. Well, this was actually before Solomon built the temple, but David even housed the sword that he cut Goliath's head off with in the temple. And so they took these things as trophies, kind of a thing, as signs of victory, right? And as tokens and memories of a victorious time. So Nebuchadnezzar did that with some of the vessels from the temple. And of course, God allowed him to do it, right? So that's the context of Daniel 1 and 2.
Was the Ark of the Covenant still there?
I think it still stayed there, yeah. They may have hid that, actually. But I'm not sure. I'm not exactly sure about that, but I think it was probably still there, I would think. But I think before the temple, and I'll have to check the history, Dick, but I think before the final invasion where the temple was destroyed, I think they may have taken it and hidden it somewhere, so it couldn't be captured. But let me check on that, and I'll follow up with you on that.
Yeah, well, people are still looking for it.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Yeah. He's exactly right.
What about Ron Wyatt? I thought he found it. Supposedly.
Yeah, I don't know how publicly I should.
Didn't they take that up to heaven finally?
Well, that's what I was about to say before Doc mentioned. There's a chance that God could have caught it up to heaven.
Because he said in the video that he approached the Ark of the Covenant and an angel appeared to him. Was talking to him. I mean,
Yeah.
both might be right.
Yeah. Well, I'm a skeptic when it comes to stuff like that, but maybe you need to pray for me because when the real deal comes, we want to be able to accept it, you know. But I think there's been a lot of speculation on the location of Noah's Ark, location of the Ark of the Covenant, and I just think we have to be careful. And I think my personal opinion is, Doc, is I think God hid some of those things. It's like in Deuteronomy 34 where the Bible says that when Moses died, they buried him, but no one knows where his grave is to this day. I think God hides those types of things because humanity has a tendency to build altars around these locations when it's not the location that's important or the object that's important. It's God that's important. But human beings tend to worship, objects. And so I think it's God's custom to hide them so that men don't form idols of those things. If that makes sense. All right, so let's read verses 3 through 7 now. Good question, though, brother. Good question. Keep them coming. All right. Now, we're picking up the story in verse 3. And the king, this is Nebuchadnezzar, spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored, and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat, and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names, for he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego. Okay, so now the enculturation process begins. If you'll notice, one central theme in this book is Babylon versus Jerusalem in a spiritual sense. and God has a lifestyle, Babylon has a lifestyle. God has a way of naming His people after His gracious acts and principles. Babylon does the same. And so, oftentimes when kingdoms were conquered and people were fortunate enough to survive and be taken into captivity without being executed, they were enculturated into that conquering culture's culture. They were taught their learning, they were taught their language, they were renamed, they were fed their lifestyle with respect to diet and customs. And you see, Daniel and his friends faced a pretty serious trial here about going into a foreign culture, and where do they accommodate and where do they stand firm on their faith principles? Which is a challenge we face today, right? Where do we accommodate our culture and where do we say, no, I'm going to be faithful to God, I'm not compromising that? That's a challenge for modern Christians. And Daniel and his friends faced that challenge. All right, so the king selected certain attractive, skilled, intelligent individuals from the royal family of Jehoiakim to train for government service in the palace. All right? And Daniel and his buddies were part of that group, right? And as a great gesture of kindness, the king offered these Hebrew trainees food and wine from his own table. I mean, this was a great gesture of kindness. Here they are, Hebrew captives in the superpower of their day, and the king was gracious enough to say, look, I'm going to give you food and wine from my own table. That's a gesture of goodwill. But the problem is that the type of food and the wine, they were not going to partake of it. So they were brought into conflict with their faith principles. You know, and they could have really jeopardized their lives, because this is the king we're talking about. All right? This king and his prince of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, renamed them after Babylonian gods. This was a complete enculturation process. Name, diet, education, etc. All right? Now, Daniel, in the Hebrew, means God is my judge. Dan, judging, like the tribe of Dan. El, God. God is my judge. Well, they named him Belteshazzar, which some sources means protect the king's life, servant of the god Bel. Okay? Then you've got Hananiah, a name that means God is gracious. He was renamed Shadrach, which means command of the moon god, according to some sources. There's differing sources on what these definitions mean in terms of the etymology of these words, the original meaning and root words. Some suggest command of the moon god. So he was named after one of the Babylonian gods. Mishael, one who belongs to God, which, by the way, is just like, it's pretty close to the name Michael, which is another name for Christ in the Bible. And Christ's name means one like God, because Christ is God. So Mishael is very close to that, one who belongs to God. Right? But he was renamed Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. And I remember reading that Aku is another Babylonian god. All right? And then you've got Azariah, which means Yahweh helps. And he was renamed Abednego, which means servant of the god Nergal. So you can see all these Hebrew boys got Babylonian names as part of this enculturation process. All right? All right, let's read verses 8 through 16, because here's where it gets a little juicy. All right? Now, after hearing that Nebuchadnezzar was going to give the food and wine from his own table to these Hebrew worthies that were selected for this 3-year training course, Daniel was brought into a predicament. Okay? Because he never drank intoxicating wine, first of all. And secondly, there were certain dietary practices that he practiced, and he could not violate those because obviously the foods that Nebuchadnezzar offered were in violation of those health principles that God gave the Jews. Okay? And also mankind, by the way, which we're going to see a little bit later. These health principles weren't just for Jewish people, they were for all of mankind. Okay? But notice right here in verse 8, and this I think is one of the key texts of this chapter, but Daniel purposed in his heart. In other words, he made a decision, right? He determined that he was not going to violate his faith principles. All right? He purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now here's a very important principle in verse 9. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Now what do you think that means? Evidently, God blessed the relationship that Daniel had with his immediate supervisor, right? And why? Because I like to believe that Daniel was courteous, he was respectful, he was obedient as far as he could be to that person, right? And he had a winsome personality. He wasn't defined. He was like, well, I'll never eat that trash, you idiot. You know, he wasn't like that. You know, he was very respectful, right? He was tactful, and he knew how to win the friendship and the heart of those that were around him. So he had an amiable disposition, right? And as a result of that, his supervisor really appreciated him. Because
didn't he make a deal with him about the vegetarian or his food?
Right.
They
Mm-hmm.
argued over it because I think the king put this other guy in charge of him, and he was worried about it. And he basically said, give us like da-da-da-da time.
Yep.
If our way don't work, then we'll go to yours.
Yep, and that's what's coming next. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's okay. So, but Daniel had this winsome, approach to dealing in human relationships, So, Kathy.
Well, also a huge thing was that the food that the king had was offered to the gods, and it was a
Yeah.
big deal.
Yes. So not only was it not a part of the Hebrew diet, but it was also dedicated to heathen gods, which made it doubly unsanctified, for lack of a better word, I guess. So, John.
Very much like the story of Joseph. All of the trials and tribulations Joseph had heaped upon him, and he just swam out on the top of everything that was thrown at him.
Yeah, exactly. And that shows it that when we're faithful to God and we're tactful in our human relationships, God's going to bless.
I was
Yeah.
also thinking Daniel prayed 3 times a day. So
Yeah.
I think he was probably praying like crazy.
Yes, I guarantee he was. Yeah, he was, okay, God, here we go. Here comes the first clash. Here comes, what do they call the sortie or salvo? Here comes the opening salvo. Help me to be faithful, right? Yeah, because invariably at some point, Daniel's faith principles and Babylonian culture were going to clash. And they were going to have to make a decision. But how many in that group of 3-year trainees compromised? We don't know exactly. But, at least Daniel and his 3 friends were faithful. All right, so verse 10. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink. For why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sort? Then ye shall make me endanger my head to the king. So when Daniel came to him and said, listen, we can't eat and drink that stuff. He's like, well, man, listen, I'm accountable to the top dog here. And if you give me trouble, he's going to put my head on the block and chop it off, all right? You're going to get me in trouble. So he said, Daniel, what are you doing, man? Why are you bucking the system, man? You're going to compromise me. You're supposed to be my friend, and I'm supposed to be your friend. You're going to jeopardize my position and even my life before the king, right? So watch what Daniel does, because Daniel is very tactful. And like you said, Mark, I'm sure he prayed, and maybe God revealed to him, ask for a 10-day test. And then God blessed them, right? So he goes on to say in verse 11, Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days, and let them give us palts, which is vegetables, to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, and the countenance of the children that eat of the portion of the king's meat. And as thou seest, deal with thy servants. And so Daniel said, listen, here's a solution. Let's try this out. Give us a 10-day test. Just give us vegetables and water. Give us the plant-based diet. We'll eat that. Give the king's diet to the rest. Then do a comparison at the end of 10 days and call it like you see it. Right? So, verse 14 says, So he consented to them in this matter and proved them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them pulse. So at the end of 10 days, he looks at them and says, man, these guys look healthier, their countenances are better, they're sharper, they're smarter, and these guys are looking sickly. Man, I like that. And he said, I'm going to go ahead and give you your requested diet for the rest of the training period. So God blessed their decision.
Now, what was it they were training for that they had to get the king's permission?
Well, they were training for top slots in the Babylonian government. Yeah, Daniel was, of course, going to be a wise man that the king would call in for counsel. And they had just different positions. And a lot of times when a conquering power would conquer, they would ingratiate the ruling structure of the conquered peoples into their government to take advantage of their skills. All right, so God blessed Daniel's relationship with his captors because of his friendly and respectful attitude, right? After learning of the Babylonian diet, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with any unhealthy food or intoxicating drink. Right? Daniel asked Melzar, the supervisor in charge of his group, if he could abstain from the king's provisions. Right? Daniel requested pulse, which is basically vegetables for food, and in the Hebrew, that Hebrew word is basically something sown. Whether it be a plant, whether it be a vegetable or a fruit or some kind of wheat, it's something that grows from a seed. It's a plant-based diet. All right? And then water to drink. All right? Melzar was worried about the king's anger. His friends healthier than the others, so he gave them the rest of training. So God blessed that decision, right? Right? Let me tell you, when we choose to follow and obey God's way, God is going to bless. Because obedience is faith in action. That's what obedience is. See, I think people in Christian circles today have this negative idea of what obedience is, and they almost equate obedience with legalism. Obeying God is the way to demonstrate our faith. That's faith expressed. So you can't separate faith and obedience. Okay?
It's also natural. So it's like sometimes we think that's why we have that. Some people have that feeling that obedience is so bad because we almost think it's someone's forcing themselves to be obedient. Where in reality, it's a natural.
It's a love response.
Love response.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Well said. Absolutely. All right. So we got Daniel and his friends getting the victory. So let's read the last 4 or 5 verses here. Verse 17, as for these 4 children, talking about Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael and Azariah, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. So because they were faithful to natural law that governed their physical being, God blessed them intellectually and spiritually. All right? Because you cannot separate the physical from the spiritual. They are interrelated. One affects the other. Okay? So God blessed them in a special way. And then verse 18, now at the end of the days, and I think this means at the end of the 3 years of training, that the king had said he should bring them in. Then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better. And in some translations it says 10 times wiser. So Daniel and his friends were blessed exponentially above even Nebuchadnezzar's own native wise men of Babylon. They were just a cut above the rest, right? So in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm. And notice this in verse 21, and Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus. So Daniel even witnessed a transference of empires. He lived so long in Babylon, which is powerful. Okay? So let's break this down. Because Daniel and his friends chose to obey God's health principles, they were blessed by God with excellent physical, intellectual, and spiritual faculties. Daniel was also blessed with the prophetic gift and was given the God gave him special revelations, and you see that in the eschatological chapters of Daniel, because Daniel's an mix of history and prophecy, right? But Daniel received those 4 major lines of visions in the book of Daniel. At the end of training, Nebuchadnezzar examined them and found them 10 times better than all the rest. Right? Found them 10 times wiser, 10 times better than all the rest. Nebuchadnezzar then promoted Daniel and his friends to top positions in the government, court, and palace. And Daniel even continued to serve in the king's government until the first year of Cyrus. And we find that in Daniel 5 and 6 when the Medo-Persian Empire conquered Babylon, and then in Daniel 6, Daniel was actually made one of 3 presidents under the king, and he was the first president of the 3 presidents. So he was basically the prime minister of Medo-Persia, in a sense. Okay? So Daniel was greatly blessed by God because of his faithfulness. All right? Now, what kind of lessons can we learn from Daniel chapter 1? There are several lessons. Number 1, God is ultimately in control of events, and nothing takes place without His divine permission. We read in the first verse of this chapter that God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to take Judah and to capture Daniel and his friends and others and capture the temple and take control of the city. God allowed it. And we know from other parts of the Bible, in the book of Jeremiah, that God allowed it because of Jehoiakim's apostasies. Jehoiakim's unfaithfulness opened the way up for Babylon to come in. So God said, listen, if you want to be unfaithful, I'm going to back off, and I'm going to let this heathen king come in and subjugate you, to teach you the fallacy of leaving my ways. Right? It also shows us that circumstances should not dictate how God's followers make choices in any given situation. If anyone ever had an excuse to compromise his principles and go with the Babylonian diet, Daniel would have been maybe in some ways justified. But he did not let circumstances dictate how he would choose even in that desperate situation. He was a slave, a captive slave, living under the superpower of that day. And he still had the moral courage to say, listen, I got to stick with God's way. So circumstances should not manipulate us. Christians should also be polite, respectful, and courteous to others at all times. This is what Daniel shows us in his dealings with his supervisors, right? Melzar and Ashpenaz. He was very winsome. He was courteous. He was polite. He had a good disposition. And it reminds me of the text in Proverbs 16:7. When a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. Right? And God certainly fulfilled that promise with Daniel, because Daniel's quote-unquote enemies, who were the Babylonians, they were at peace with him because Daniel wanted to be pleasing to God, and he reflected a Christ-like disposition. And that was attractive to them because he was respectful. All right? So that's one lesson. That's another lesson. Okay, here's another lesson. If we choose to be faithful to God, if we purpose in our hearts, He can bless our choices even in the most trying and unfavorable circumstances. When it comes to making decisions, we've got to choose and then not deviate. And God will bless. Because God doesn't like double-mindedness. Remember, James says a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. God wants singleness of purpose. All right? And then finally, if we strive to follow God's health principles by eating the most natural diet possible, our efforts in this area will promote the best possible physical, intellectual, and spiritual health because they're all interrelated. This whole idea of separating the being into physical and spiritual and mental dimensions, that's a human construction. All of those faculties and powers are interrelated. You cannot separate them. And one influences the other. Okay? Now, this leads us to a question. What are God's health principles? All right? Well, let's talk about this for a minute. First of all, we need to understand that our bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, right? Paul said that in the New Testament, right? What? Know ye not that your bodies are the temple of the Holy Ghost which is in you, and you're not your own, for you're bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which is your mind, which belong to God. Right? These bodies are physical and spiritual temples for God. Would you agree? Right? Okay? These temples are not to be defiled. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, 16 and 17, Paul wrote that whoever defiles the temple of God, this is kind of a hard saying, God is going to destroy. Because you are the temple of God, Paul told the Corinthian believers.
Okay, now I've got a question about the tattoo thing.
Okay?
If someone, when they're younger, they get a tattoo because they're stupid, they make dumb choices, and then years later they decide they regret the fact that they have it. Does that harm their relationship with God permanently? Or
You know what I tell people? Don't get any more. And God winks at ignorance. God can forgive. Even when we violate God's health principles, God can forgive us if we're sincere in our repentance. But I just tell people that, because people have come to me about this issue and said, well, I've marked up my body temple. I'm like, well, just don't get any more. Pastor who baptized me, he's got Rolling Stones, the lips right on his back shoulder blade, and he's got this big lion on his arm. And he told me, he said, Mark, when I was born again, man, the Lord told me, no mas. No more ink on the body. Hundreds of times about it. They prayed, and they went into the shower one day, and they were taking a shower. I haven't confirmed that myself, but I wouldn't put it past God to do things like that for people. Yeah, that's right. No, I'm just encouraging you, if you do have tats, just don't get any more. Yeah. All right. Now, nuts and vegetables, those things that came from seeds, right? Okay? That was the original diet, which was a plant-based diet. No animal foods were in the original human diet. And animal foods were first allowed during the flood, okay, during the time of Noah. And the reason why is that, first of all, there are two reasons why, actually. Number one, Noah offered sacrifices to God. And if you look at the right? So it's interesting. They look at the whole family while the earth's vegetation was replenished. God also permitted the Israelites to use quote-unquote clean meats for food after the Exodus. Okay? What's interesting about that is no fat or blood could be eaten in the meat. They had to drain the fat and the blood out of all flesh meats. And the reason and different things, and God wanted them to make sure that they treated that flesh meat properly so that they were ingesting the safest possible food that wouldn't harm health. Here, like that.
Do I need to give up my chicken?
Well, fowl. Let's get to environment. People believe that Christ and Peter and Paul said it's okay now to eat anything. In reality, when you look at those texts very closely in the New Testament, talking about food, okay? The eating of all types of 5 verse bread. And then don't wash their right? So he was trying to bring his disciples beyond those racial. So in Acts chapter 10, the issue is people, not food, okay? Now also, Paul did not advocate the eating of all foods in Romans 14 and 1 Corinthians 8. Clean meats that were offered to idols, right? The issue in required to. And listen, Jews, if they want to eat meat, destroy Christ, what the Bible says. Shall when the second. Okay. Now, when alcohol was consumed by approved intoxicating beverages, and Proverbs in the wisdom literature about avoiding alcohol. And in fact, in the Bible to show specific dietary restrictions, no wine, drink. John the Baptist, who is John what you want. Drink. day. We grow, we refine our lifestyle. Your life. maybe I'll circumstances that he found himself in. Royal court, became a man of unbending integrity and fervent devotion to God. He was subjected to the fierce temptations of sin, yet his character was not vacillating, nor his unchangeable. He was firm where many. He was true. He was where they would be weak. Daniel was a lofty cedar of Lebanon, and that's just a phrase that means he was a pillar. He was a solid tree that couldn't be swayed despite how hard the wind would blow. Would that the faith, integrity, and devotion of the prophet Daniel might live in the hearts of God's people of today. Never were these noble qualities more needed in the world than now. Never was there a greater need of men who will stand firmly and fearlessly for God and the right. You see, Daniel couldn't be moved from his faith, right? And he wasn't a jerk about it. He wasn't disrespectful and arrogant about it like some Christians are. He was a gentle giant spiritually. Amiable disposition, loving, caring, friendly, but yet firm as a rock when it came to not deviating from what God had shown him and what he practiced for faith principles. And that's the kind of balance I think we need as Christians. We need to be very graceful toward others, but in our own convictions, stand firm for what we believe in a gentle way. All right, those are my thoughts on Daniel 1. So we got through the first chapter. Of course, Daniel 2 is going to be a little bit longer because there's about 47, 48, 49 verses in Daniel 2. So, any thoughts?
Yes, in my classes I take, there's been multiple times where they've encouraged me to use the word higher power. Because it is a mental health facility, and then there was an incident where one of them told me that I really shouldn't be bringing up God because I might be scared of the other recovering people. And I told them, I said, absolutely, I will not use the word higher power. And I said, absolutely, I will not talk about my faith. I said, I'm not going to be a Bible thumper and, push it on somebody, but I will be the light. And, there's no chance to be dropping that.
What did they say to you when you said that?
They backed off because they knew I wasn't going to budge.
Okay. Well, that's good. Good. Yeah, you don't open your Bible too wide,
Right.
But you drop seeds. This higher power, guess what? It's God and Jesus Christ. Yeah, that's good.
Because I've led 2 people to Christ because of that. They were curious about what I had.
Yeah, that's great. And see, God's going to use you in that circle of influence to plant seeds in people's hearts and minds. And that's why we're here, right? We're here to sow the seed of the Word. Right? So, any other thoughts? Dick, you look like you got some good stuff for me. Lay it on me, brother.
Go back to the principles.
Okay. The quote?
No, keep going. The principles that you listed there.
Okay, which ones?
Keep going. He gives me, it was sort of combines that he gives, there's nothing happens
So what do you say? Did you
Yeah.
to operate?
Well, he gave Satan room in heaven.
Yep. And he gave Satan room with Job,
Yeah,
right? In other situations.
that was under his permission.
Right. And I think God does that to show his created intelligent beings. Look what happens when I give room. Because when Satan started against God, he raised a question. God, you're not. And so now there's this controversy being played out between Christ and Satan, to where all intelligent beings are looking to see, okay, who's right in this? Was Satan right to question God, or is God just? And God gave Satan room with Job. Look what he did. He just trashed the brother. Trashed his, he killed his family, killed all his property, smote him with boils, gave him a miserable existence. Look what happens when I trust affairs to Satan. And I think every time he gives Satan room, he puts another nail in his coffin in the judgment.
Well, people who leave, well, Mark probably can understand this. People who lose a loved one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wrestle with, why did God allow that?
Yeah. Why did little Deborah have to die?
Yeah.
Why did Samuel Choi have to be run over right in front of my son on a hayride?
Yeah.
Let alone devastate his family. Why God? And I look at it this way, because we preached about 4 sermons right in a row after that happened at the church.
Some people get caught in the crossfire that just...
Well, some of that happens sometimes out of circumstance, but I still think that that's a little bit too circumstantial for me. I still think God, that almost suggests that God's not in control too. I still think that God's ultimately in control. Now, what I say to people is this. And this is the textbook explanation. When you go through something, it's a lot more trying. So I'm speaking as some major, maybe minor tragedy. Nothing I would go through what that town or what the Hellies went through. But there's always a higher purpose for everything. Even though God allows Satan to have room and cause problems, there's still a blessing to be gained out of that tragedy or problem that Satan causes, because there's a higher purpose. Christ's sacrifice.
I mean, isn't it a test of faith? I mean,
It's a test, but look at Christ's sacrifice. Satan threw every demon and himself at Christ and crushed out his life on the cross through the weight of sin. But look at the blessing. He rose, and now there'll be souls saved. So there is always a salvational and redemptive higher purpose for what God allows, good or bad. We can't always see that. Look at Joseph's example. When he was reconciled with his brothers, God did send me to Egypt beforehand to preserve life. Wait a minute. His brothers threw him in a pit. They beat him up. They sold him to Midianite, Ishmaelite traders, who then sold him Deborah's. Well, here are some thoughts. God allows it or causes it directly. There are times when God will lay people to sleep directly. so blown away, he went to the pastor the next Sabbath in my life. And that boy got baptized as a result of what happened. When we had that funeral, there were 1,000 people at that funeral, 600 in the sanctuary, which if the fire marshal was in there, he would have shut us down, and then 400 in the fellowship hall. And how many people were on the fence spiritually when that happened, who were won to Christ? The point is that there's always a higher purpose for it, you know. But it's hard to explain. You know, why did 9/11 happen? Why did all those people die in one sitting? You know, it's the age-old question, why do bad things happen sometimes? And it's hard, man. It's hard. And I realize, and from a human perspective, we can't always see the bigger picture like that. And that's where what you said, Doug, we just have to trust, because it's a faith thing. But I remember reading a quotation, I think it was from the Great Controversy, where it says, when we get to heaven and we will look at the course of our lives, good and bad, we would not have changed a thing. Because every test and trial was calculated to get us into the eternal city. Anyway, I'm exhausted now, Dick. I'm going to take a break and let Joe talk. I don't know if that helped, Dick, but I do agree with you. I know I banter with you a little bit, but I do agree with you. It's hard. We wrestle through these things. It's not easy, is it? It's not easy.
No, it isn't.
No. Go ahead, Joe.
In connection with what you're saying, my parents were non-Christian when they were alive.
You know, boy, I said to them, I said, listen, heart out right now. And I would say this to the Hellies, and I think I've talked to I said, listen, think about I know your heart's being ripped, avoiding your heart until Jesus comes, you know, you lose a part.
Coliseum when I was up there. There is no back door to heaven.
Mm-hmm. We're going to be going in the front door, aren't we?
It's
Through the Word.
12 entrances, and Jesus Christ has the key to each every.
Mm-hmm.
You can question, you can finagle, and you can slip and slide, as one song had. There's only one God, and there's one judge,